The flippers on my Elvira don't feel snappy. My other machines have a nice solid metal-on-metal sound, whereas these flippers have a dull thunk. It also kind of seems like they don't cradle the ball as well as my other machines, as if the flippers aren't going up enough to hold the ball. I'll show you what I mean. I don't know how well this is going to come across on video, but these flippers just don't sound right. Well-maintained flippers should feel snappy. When the flipper activates, you should hear a sharp metal-on-metal sound as the plunger hits the coil stop. But these flippers sound dull. And they're inconsistent. Sometimes they sound snappy, but most of the time they don't. If you listen closely, you can even hear them buzzing when you hold the flipper up. That buzzing sound is a symptom of the plunger not making clean contact with the coil stop. Let's compare with my Cyclone. Elvira and Cyclone are both System 11 games. They both use the same flipper mechanism, and I rebuilt the flippers on both of these machines around the same time, so they should sound about the same. But you can hear that Cyclone has a snappy metal-on-metal sound, while Elvira just sounds dull by comparison. Maybe some of this is just in my head, or based on the sound, but these flippers just don't feel as nice as my other machines. For one thing, they don't seem to cradle the ball as well. When I try to cradle the ball, lots of times it will roll up the flipper enough that I can't catch it. So, I think there's something wrong with these flippers. Let's take a look under the playfield. It's been several years since I rebuilt these flippers, but I don't actually play pinball very much. I spend most of my time repairing. So these flippers haven't seen too many plays since I rebuilt them. They look to be in really good shape. The end of stroke switches are clean, and they look like they're making pretty good contact. I don't feel any friction between the plunger and the sleeve and the coil. The link isn't worn down. There's not a lot of slack in between the link and the paw. They feel really good. There's not a lot of dirt buildup anywhere that's causing any extra friction. Everything looks pretty clean. So I don't think the problem is wear. I think the problem is I have an incorrect part installed, and it's this link here. I'll show you what I mean. These are the parts that you get in a typical flipper rebuild kit for a System 11 game like Elvira. The problem is this assembly right here, specifically the linkage, this plastic part right here. The linkage that I have installed in Elvira is meant for a WPC machine, a later Williams system from about 10 years newer than Elvira. That type of linkage is not the right part to use with the spring that the System 11 games use. The problem is that this linkage doesn't leave room for the spring to compress. You can see how the correct part tapers on the end. This leaves room for the spring to compress around the linkage. But this incorrect part has a rounded linkage that doesn't leave room for the spring when it compresses. This causes the spring to bind up the linkage, which stops the plunger from being pulled all the way into the solenoid and prevents the plunger from making good, solid contact against the coil stop. The loose contact between the plunger and the coil stop is causing the vibration and buzzing noise when I hold the flipper. And the linkage binding up the spring might be causing the flipper to not flip as high as it should. But more importantly, it's making the flippers feel dull and inconsistent. The rounded linkage is not a bad part. It actually might be a better part. But it's definitely not the correct part for this style of flipper. Williams made several changes to their flipper mechanisms over the years. There are a bunch of different variants and part numbers, but I like to group them into 3 different categories: System 9 style, System 11 style, and WPC style. These 3 types of flippers cover a lot of games from the mid-80s to the late 90s. Williams had different styles of flippers before these, but these are the styles that I'm most familiar with, because they're the ones that my machines use. I've got System 9 and System 11 and WPC in scare quotes, because the style of flippers don't exactly line up with the different Williams pinball systems. What I call System 9 style flippers are actually used by some early System 11 machines too. And some early WPC machines use what I call System 11 style flippers. But in general, System 9 machines use System 9 style. Most System 11 machines use System 11 style, and most WPC machines use WPC style. Williams made incremental improvements over the years. I'll get to the details in a minute, but in general, System 9 machines use a tapered return spring around the plunger, a serial wound coil with a continuous winding, and a high voltage end of stroke switch to increase and decrease the resistance of the coil. In System 11 machines, Williams introduced parallel wound coils with two separate windings, one strong and one weak. Because of this change, Williams added a capacitor across the EOS switch to reduce arcing and prolong the life of the switch. With WPC machines, Williams introduced an external return spring that doesn't interfere with the plunger. This allowed them to use a more robust, rounded linkage. They also introduced Fliptronics, where the computer controls the coil and the EOS is a low voltage switch. The linkage that's in my Elvira is meant for a WPC machine with an external plunger return spring, but Elvira is a System 11 machine with a concentric return spring. The linkage I'm using is not meant for the System 11 style of spring. The fix here is simple. Just swap out the crank and linkage assembly with the correct System 11 part. But this little difference got me interested, and I took a deep dive to figure out exactly what all the differences are between the different types of flipper mechanisms. Parts retailers generally sell 3 different Williams rebuild kits, based around these 3 date ranges. But back in the day, Williams flippers went through 6 major iterations over those 15 or so years, and each of those used a different part number for the flipper assembly. These are the core 6 assemblies that were used by nearly all of the Williams machines of this era. There were some minor variations on these assemblies, mostly for game-specific fitment issues, and each of those variations had their own part numbers. For instance, you can see how C10605 is a minor variation on C9953 to remove one of the bracket's mounting legs for fitment. But these 6 core assemblies form the basis for the flipper assemblies that are used across all System 9, System 11, and WPC machines. Let's take a look at each of these assemblies and the differences between them. C9952 and C9953 are the assemblies used in System 9 and early System 11 machines. The System 7 assemblies came before these, and I don't dive into System 7 assemblies in this video, but System 9 brought 2 key improvements over those older assemblies. This assembly introduced the modular coil stop, allowing you to remove and replace the coil stop when it started to mushroom. This was the first assembly to use a tapered plunger return spring that did not bind up when the plunger was pulled into the coil. Both of these improvements are not drawn correctly in this exploded view from the parts catalog. The coil stop is drawn with a hole, with the coil sleeve going through it, but of course that's not how it works. It was a new part at the time, so the engineer might have gotten it confused with how the coil bracket works. The plunger return spring is drawn incorrectly too. Instead of being tapered, the spring is drawn like the previous System 7 spring. Both of these drawing errors were corrected in the next assembly. C9952 and C9953 assemblies use a serial wound coil with a single contiguous winding and a single snubber diode. The EOS switch carries the full voltage of the flipper and shorts a portion of the winding when it's closed. The flipper brackets included an integrated switch stake for the EOS switch and the lane change switch. Unlike future assemblies, this stake is not removable. With this assembly, the lane change switch stack was actually included as part of the bracket subassembly. And that's why there are 2 part numbers. C9952 has a lane change switch, and C9953 does not. Note that drawings of C9952-L are incorrect in operator manuals. They're incorrectly shown without a lane change switch, but games that use C9952-L do have a lane change switch on the left side. The next major assembly was C11626, which debuted in System 11 machines, starting with F14 Tomcat. C11626 was the first assembly to reverse the orientation of the coil so that the solder lugs were next to the coil bracket, instead of being next to the coil stop. This orientation reduces the amount of vibration that is transferred to the solder joints and makes the flippers a bit more reliable. This assembly introduced parallel wound coils, where the power winding and the hold winding are both active during the flipper stroke, and the EOS switch entirely removes the power winding from circuit while holding the flipper. This gave the flippers more power, but abruptly disconnecting the power winding caused electrical arcing across the switch, which deteriorated flipper performance over time. To address this issue, Williams added a capacitor across the EOS switch to reduce arcing. C11626 also increased the height of the coil stop by 1 mm. Why? I don't know why. Maybe the extra material made the coil stop last longer. Or maybe they were intentionally reducing the flipper travel to make it harder to catch and cradle the ball. C13174 debuted with Diner and was used on late System 11 machines and early WPC machines. C13174 introduced the modular removable switch stake. The switch stake attaches to the flipper bracket and holds the EOS switch. The new modular switch stake made it easy to remove the switches from the bracket without taking the switches apart. C13174 was the first assembly to completely remove the lane change switch from the flipper assembly. Previous assemblies placed the low voltage lane change switch on the switch stake next to the high voltage EOS switch. This caused reliability issues. Starting with C13174, lane change switches were expected to be handled using optocouplers on the interconnect or power driver board. Note that the crank in this diagram is drawn upside down from how it must be installed in the assembly. This discrepancy is in all of the subsequent System 11 and WPC exploded parts diagrams. A15318 is an interesting assembly. It's only used in one machine, Hurricane in 1991, but I think it's an important assembly. We'll talk about why in a minute. The previous assembly, C13174, revised the switch stake in preparation for a new plunger return spring, and this assembly, A15318, introduced that new spring. This assembly replaces the previous compression spring with a new expansion spring, connected between the crank and the switch stake. The old spring interfered with the plunger's travel and caused wear on the plunger over time. This new expansion spring solved both of those problems. Note that the EOS switch wiring in this diagram differs from the previous assembly. I think this is an error in the A15318 diagram. You should never count on coils to be wired the same, but all of the coils that I've seen require the EOS switch to be connected across the lugs shown in the previous diagram. Happily, this is the last assembly where we will have to worry about a high voltage EOS switch. A15318 is a unique in-between assembly. It has a high voltage EOS switch and capacitor, like previous System 11 assemblies, but it has the expansion spring used in later WPC assemblies. The previous assembly and this assembly were both transitional assemblies, at the end of System 11 and at the beginning of WPC, where Williams was preparing for the next major change. A15205 was the first assembly that was used in Williams' new solid-state flipper control system, called Fliptronics. Up until now, the flipper cabinet switches and EOS switches were carrying the full voltage of the flippers. Switching such a high voltage causes wear on the switch and decreases the performance of the flippers over time. Fliptronics transferred control of the flippers to the CPU and replaced all of the problematic high-voltage switches with reliable low-voltage switches. This was a revolutionary change for flippers, but a relatively minor change for the flipper assembly. The only change made for A15205 was the EOS switch. The normally closed high-voltage tungsten contact switch that was used in the previous assemblies was replaced with a normally open low-voltage switch with gold contacts. Note that manuals and catalogs use an incorrect part number for this switch. The correct switch is an SW1A194, a normally open switch. The switch is often referred to incorrectly as SW1A193, which is a normally closed switch. The final WPC flipper assembly was A15849. Compared to the previous assemblies, the changes in A15849 were relatively minor. The coil bracket in previous assemblies had hooks to center the concentric plunger return spring, but these were no longer necessary with the new expansion spring, so they were removed, leaving the coil bracket smooth. Note that the bracket is drawn incorrectly in diagrams, with the hooks still present. A15849 increased the height of the coil stop by an additional 0.7 millimeters. The most important change was a new, more robust linkage. The new linkage was 0.6 millimeters thicker, and since it did not have to fit inside of the compression spring, the linkage was able to have a more robust, rounded shape. This round linkage is what I have mistakenly installed on my Elvira. These are the 6 core assemblies that Williams used in the mid-80s to late 90s, from System 9 through WPC. C9952 and C9953 were used from mid-1984 to early 1987 for System 9 and early System 11 machines. C11626 was used from 1987 to 1991 for System 11 and early WPC machines. It made a minor change to the coil stop and introduced parallel wound coils with a capacitor to prolong the life of the EOS switch. C13174 was used from 1990 to 1991 for late System 11 and early WPC machines. It introduced the modular switch stake and moved the lane change switches to the back box. A15318 was used in 1991 for Hurricane, which was an early WPC machine. It replaced the concentric plunger return spring with an expansion spring. A15205 was used in 1992 and 1993 for early WPC machines. It was the first assembly to be used with solid-state Fliptronic flippers, and introduced the low-voltage EOS switch to give the flippers more consistent, reliable performance. And A15849 was used from 1993 through 1998 for the remainder of the WPC machines. It made a minor change to the coil bracket and coil stop, and updated the crank link subassembly to strengthen the linkage and extend the life of the flippers. There were 3 different crank link subassemblies used during the 80s and 90s. The flipper link is one of many parts that were collected under that single subassembly part number, and using the wrong flipper link is what caused my problem on Elvira, so I'm especially interested in that subassembly. The 3 different crank link subassemblies are all pretty similar, but there are differences between them. B10655 was used for System 9 and System 11 machines across 3 different flipper assemblies. It has a tapered flipper link meant for use with the concentric plunger return spring. B13882 was introduced with Hurricane and was used for early WPC machines. It added the spring retainer bracket for use with the expansion spring. This addition required a slightly longer screw to hold the mechanism together. A15848 was used for the remainder of the WPC machines. It replaced the tapered link with a thicker, rounded link. The thicker link required a wider crank and longer link spacer bushing. Though there were some changes between these crank link assemblies, they're mostly backward compatible. The thicker link introduced in WPC machines is a better, more robust part, and you could use it in your System 9 and System 11 machines if you really wanted to. It will bind up on your spring, but it will still work. In fact, Williams themselves eventually started using the WPC crank link in old System 11 mechanisms. About a year after they introduced the new crank link for WPC machines, they began shipping their old System 11 flipper assemblies with a new WPC part. This happened in May of 1994, 3 years after the last System 11 machine was produced. I know this because I've got the original Williams engineering drawing for the C11626 flipper mechanism. This is the original, one-of-a-kind, hand-drawn engineering diagram. It lists all of the revisions and changes to parts. You can even see where original parts were whited out and replaced. I combed through the revision table and tracked the part numbers. There are some interesting revisions. The first use of the C11626 assembly was in F-14 Tomcat, which went into production in March of 1987. It wasn't until March of 1987 that Williams updated the drawing with the coils that F-14 uses for its upper flippers. Conventional pinball wisdom says that you should orient your coils so that the solder lugs are next to the coil bracket instead of next to the coil stop. This reduces the amount of vibration transferred to the solder joints. Williams did not do this themselves until December of 1987. In February of 1988, Williams increased the height of the coil stop from 6.3 millimeters to 7.3 millimeters, which was a pretty big increase. This is the last revision of the assembly that was used in production. It was used all the way up to Terminator 2, produced in July of 1991. 3 years after the last use of the assembly, Williams made a couple interesting revisions. First, they changed the flipper bracket. Remember, this assembly used a bracket with an integrated, non-removable switch stake. But in May of 1994, they changed and repackaged the assembly to make use of the modular switch stake that WPC used. Then a few days later, they changed the assembly again to use the coil stop and crank link assembly from WPC machines. I suspect these changes were aimed at reducing manufacturing cost. They consolidated the number of parts they had to support and manufacture. What's especially interesting to me is that the machines that used this mechanism were still using the concentric plunger return spring, so switching to the rounded link would bind up that spring. This may be why they simultaneously increased the height of the coil stop. The extra 0.7 millimeters would have reduced the amount of binding, but that comes at the expense of reduced flipper travel. Happily, there is no need to compromise when you are buying rebuild kits today. Williams may have stopped supporting the older parts, but present-day pinball parts retailers have taken up the mantle, and you can get all of the original spec parts for each of the flipper mechanisms. If you have a System 9 or System 11 machine, then you have a choice. You can rebuild your older flipper mechanisms with the original spec parts and keep with the original design, or you can upgrade your machines with newer WPC parts and increase the longevity of the components. If you want to maintain the original mechanism design, then just use the parts listed for whichever mechanism you have. If you want to update the mechanism, you can substitute some of the original parts with newer parts from the final WPC mechanism. Earlier mechanisms need a few parts replaced. Later mechanisms need less. Just make sure that you update all of the parts indicated. For instance, if you want to update your C13174 mechanism, then you need to update both the plunger return spring and the crank link assembly, not just one of them. And that brings me back to the problem that I had with my Elvira. I used a rebuild kit that packaged a WPC crank link assembly with an old-style concentric plunger return spring. If I wanted to update that mechanism to WPC parts, then I would need to replace both the spring and the crank link. But I want to keep the mechanisms original. I like seeing the differences between the different flipper mechanisms in my machines, especially since I have the original engineering drawings for a couple of them. So the fix for me is to revert that crank link assembly back to the original part. And I think I'll replace the coil stop while I'm at it, because whatever rebuild kit I used came with some dubious parts, and now I'm not really sure which coil stop is installed. I'm only going to replace the coil stop, crank link, and coil sleeve. If I were doing a full rebuild, I'd remove the whole mechanism and replace the EOS switch, capacitor, and flipper bushing. But I've already rebuilt these flippers, and those parts are all in pretty good shape, so I'm not going to mess with them. To remove the crank link, you have to loosen the pawl, pull the flipper out from the playfield, remove the coil stop, and shift the coil a bit. Then you can pull out the crank link and spring. This is a good time to replace the coil sleeve. These were still in good shape, but they're cheap and easy, and they do get dirty, and dirt creates friction. I'm using the same original plunger spring, and I know there are people out there that think this is silly, and that you should always update to the expansion spring. I have all the parts to do that, but I'm not going to do it. 2 reasons. First, the switch stake is integrated into the flipper bracket on the C11626 mechanism, and I'd have to drill a hole in it to hold the expansion spring. I could do that, but I'm lazy. Second, and more importantly, I like keeping the mechanisms original. I enjoy seeing the evolution across my 4 machines, and I like being able to lift up the playfield and show people the mechanisms that match the engineering drawings that I have. So, I'm just restoring these mechanisms back to the original spec parts. It's important to align the flippers correctly. There are a couple holes at the playfield that you can stick a toothpick into and press the flipper against it as you're tightening the pawl. I'm using a flipper gauge between the flipper and the flipper bushing. That ensures that there's a little bit of play, about a 32nd of an inch, between the flipper and the bushing, so that the flipper doesn't bind up. Make sure to tighten the pawl pretty tight around the flipper shaft. Then check the alignment on the top side of the playfield. The flipper should line up with the flipper return rails, so that the ball rolls smoothly across them. Of course, the flippers should be symmetrical, both when they're at rest and when they're raised. Alright, let's see if these feel any better now that they have the right parts. Oh yeah, that's a lot better. They feel really crisp. And they're not buzzing anymore either. The flippers feel and sound much better now. The parts that I think would have made the difference are the coil stop. This is the one that was in the machine. And this is one from a new rebuild kit of a C11626 mechanism. I think the right coil stop was in there. These both seem to be the same height as far as I can tell. So I don't think it was the coil stop. I think the actual problem was the crank link assembly. So this is the one that was in the machine. Definitely a WPC style link on this one. And this is the correct C11626 crank link assembly. I think just changing this out would have fixed the problem. So I changed both the coil stop and the crank link assembly just to be sure, but I think this right here was the problem, and specifically this link. The mechanism works much better with the correct tapered link. There were many subtle changes to Williams flippers during the 80s and 90s. Your flippers will not feel right if you use the wrong combination of parts, but it's not always clear which parts you should use for a particular machine. Whether you are updating your flippers with the latest WPC parts, or just rebuilding them per the original design, I hope this video has helped you understand the differences between the different flipper mechanisms, and that it will help you choose the right parts to keep your flippers strong and snappy.